My name is Dr. Elias Vance, and if you've ever poured your soul into something, I mean truly bled for it, only to have it ripped away by the very people who were supposed to protect you, then you might understand what happened on that cold November evening. It was the Tuesday before Thanksgiving, a night that has replayed in my mind 1,000 times since. In our family, Tuesday dinners were a tradition, a non-negotiable command performance at my father's palatial estate in Greenwich, Connecticut. The table was always set for a state dinner, even if the meal was just roasted chicken, sterling silver, Waterford crystal, and porcelain so fine you were afraid to breathe on it. It was all part of the carefully constructed theater of the Vance family. Immense wealth, impeccable taste, and a deep, unspoken brokenness that festered just beneath the polished surface. That night, the air was different. It was heavy, charged with an electricity I couldn't place. My father, Richard Vance, a man who moved through the world like he owned it because, in many ways, he did was uncharacteristically quiet during the soup course. He kept glancing at my older brother, Marcus, who wore the smug, confident grin of a man who's just been told he's won a race he didn't even know he was running. My mother, Eleanor, simply refilled her wine glass, her practiced smile never quite reaching her eyes. You see, I was the anomaly at that table, the ghost in their machine. Marcus was the heir apparent, groomed since birth to take over Vance Industries, our family's multinational logistics empire. He had the business degree from Wharton, the easy charm, and the ruthless pragmatism my father admired. I, on the other hand, was the scientist, the dreamer. While Marcus learned about mergers and acquisitions, I was in a lab, decoding the very language of life itself. For the past decade, my entire existence had been consumed by a single audacious goal: creating a viable therapeutic pathway to halt and potentially reverse the effects of neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's. I called it Project Chimera. It was my life's work, funded reluctantly by a small, forgotten R&D subsidiary of Vance Industries that my father treated as my expensive hobby. He never understood it. To him, science that didn't yield immediate, quarterly profits was little more than academic masturbation. He couldn't see the forest for the trees. He only saw the cost of the fertilizer. As the main course was served, a perfectly prepared beef Wellington that I couldn't taste, my father cleared his throat, tapping his fork against his crystal glass. The sound was like a gavel. The room fell silent. "We have some family business to discuss," he announced, his voice imbued with the kind of boardroom authority that made generals straighten their spines. He looked around the table, his gaze lingering on me for a fraction of a second too long. There was no warmth there, only calculation. "As you all know," he began, "Elias has been working on his project for many years. A noble endeavor, to be sure. But Vance Industries is a business, not a charity. The board has been pressuring me to liquidate unprofitable assets, and the R&D division has been a significant drain on our resources for a decade with no return on investment." Every word was a carefully aimed dart. I felt my stomach clench. I knew the research was on the cusp of a breakthrough. I had just achieved a stable protein fold a week prior, a milestone I had been working toward for 3 years. It was the key, the absolute key to making the therapy viable. I was going to tell him after dinner, to show him the data, to finally prove that my hobby was about to change the world. But I never got the chance. Marcus leaned forward, placing his elbows on the table, a predator sensing the kill. "What Dad is trying to say, little brother," he said, his voice dripping with condescending pity, "is that we've found a way to turn your little science experiment into something useful." My father took his cue. "Omnigen Pharmaceuticals approached us last month," he said, his tone final. "They've been tracking a number of smaller research projects in the neurotherapeutic space. They were impressed with the theoretical framework of your data. They see potential. Long-term potential, of course." He paused, taking a sip of water, letting the suspense build. I felt a cold dread wash over me. Omnigen was a corporate behemoth. They didn't invest in early-stage research. They strip-mined it, acquiring patents and burying anything that competed with their existing blockbuster drugs. So, my father continued, placing his hands flat on the table, we've made an executive decision. We're selling them your research. All of it. The data, the methodologies, the patents pending. The deal closes on Friday. The silence that followed was deafening. I stared at him, trying to process the words. Selling. My research. It felt like he had just announced he was selling my child, my soul. I had poured my youth, my relationships, my very being into those ice-cold freezers and humming sequencers. Every late night, every missed holiday, every sacrifice was contained in the terabytes of data he was now dismissing as an unprofitable asset. How much? The words came out as a hoarse whisper. My father's chest puffed out. He was proud of the number. He thought it would impress me, placate me. $20 million, he said, as if bestowing a great gift. A respectable sum for purely theoretical work. It will more than cover the division's losses over the years and inject some much-needed capital back into the main business. $20 million. To him, it was a good business deal. To Omnigen, it was pocket change, a rounding error on their annual budget. To me, it was the price of a miracle, sold for pennies on the dollar before it even had the chance to be born. They were selling a map to El Dorado for the price of the parchment it was written on. The true value wasn't in the millions. It was in the billions. Potentially, it was priceless. It was the chance to give millions of people their minds back, their memories back, their lives back. And he had just sold it. My brother, Marcus, raised his glass. To finally getting the family business back on track, he toasted, looking directly at me. No more distractions. My mother just looked down at her plate, her silence a form of consent that was somehow more painful than their words. And in that moment, sitting at that magnificent table surrounded by all the trappings of success, I had never felt so poor. I looked at my father, the architect of my career and now its executioner. I looked at my brother, his face alight with schadenfreude. And I looked at the reflection of a broken man in the polished silver knife beside my plate. They thought they had won. They thought they had tidily cut away the part of the family that didn't fit, and made a neat profit doing it. They had no idea what they had just done. They had sold the research, yes, but they hadn't sold the scientist. They hadn't sold the mind that understood the data in a way no one else on the planet could. And there was one piece of the puzzle, one critical, irreplaceable key that I had never written down, never uploaded to a server, never shared with a single soul. A secret I held locked away in the one place they could never access, my own mind. They thought the story was over, but as I sat there, a quiet, cold fury beginning to burn away the shock, I knew it was just the beginning. If you know what it feels like to have your back against the wall, to be underestimated and betrayed, then hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Because this isn't just a story about losing a dream. It's a story about what it takes to steal it back, piece by agonizing piece, and build an empire from the ashes. You're not going to want to miss what happened next. To understand the depth of that betrayal, you have to understand what Project Chimera really was. It wasn't just a job or a line item on a corporate budget. It was a promise I made to a ghost. My grandmother, Evelyn Vance, was the heart of our family. She was the one who saw the world not just for what it was, but for what it could be. While my father saw balance sheets, she saw beauty. While Marcus saw competitors, she saw collaborators. And when she looked at me, a quiet, awkward boy who preferred the company of microscopes to people, she didn't see an oddity. She saw a gift. She was the one who bought me my first chemistry set, who drove me to the science museum every other weekend, and who listened for hours as I tried to explain the elegant dance of proteins and the magic of cellular biology. She was my champion. And then, I watched her disappear. Alzheimer's is a thief. It doesn't just steal a person. It steals them piece by piece, memory by memory, until all you're left with is a hollowed-out shell of the person you loved. I was 16 when she first started forgetting things. Small things at first, where she put her keys, the name of a new neighbor. By the time I was in my freshman year at Stanford, studying biochemistry, she could no longer remember my name. I would sit by her bed during college breaks, holding her hand, and see the flicker of confusion in her eyes. She knew I was familiar, that I was someone she was supposed to love, but the connection was gone. The data was corrupted. My father and Marcus dealt with it in their way. They hired the best nurses, secured a room in the most exclusive care facility, and wrote the checks. They managed the logistics of her decline. I, on the other hand, made a vow at her bedside. I wasn't going to manage the disease. I was going to destroy it. That vow became my obsession. I double majored in biochemistry and computational neuroscience. I graduated at the top of my class and was accepted into a prestigious PhD program at MIT. My thesis focused on a radical new theory, that neurodegenerative diseases weren't a single monolithic problem, but a highly personalized one. The genetic markers, the protein misfolds, the plaque buildups, they were unique to each individual's genome, like a biological fingerprint. Therefore, a one-size-fits-all cure was impossible. What was needed was a platform, a system that could create a bespoke therapeutic agent for each patient. It was audacious, bordering on science fiction, and my academic advisors told me it was the work of a lifetime, not a PhD dissertation. They were right. It took me 6 years to prove the foundational concept. The day I defended my thesis, my father and Marcus attended. They sat in the back of the auditorium, looking at their watches. Afterward, at the celebratory lunch, my father clapped me on the shoulder. "Well done, son," he said. "You've got a lot of fancy letters after your name now. When are you going to come home and do some real work?" Real work meant a corner office at Vance Industries, managing shipping routes or optimizing supply chains. It was a future I wanted no part of. I presented him with a counteroffer. I laid out the vision for Project Chimera. I explained how, with the right resources, I could build on my doctoral work and create the platform I had theorized. I didn't ask for a blank check. I asked for a chance. Reluctantly, he agreed, but on his terms. He wouldn't create a new biotech company. That was too risky, too far outside his comfort zone. Instead, he buried me in an old, forgotten subsidiary called Vance Scientific Solutions, a company my grandfather had started decades ago to produce industrial cleaning agents. He gave me a warehouse in a desolate industrial park in Bridgeport, a shoestring budget, and a single instruction: don't embarrass me. For the next 10 years, that warehouse was my world. I hired a small, brilliant team of researchers, misfits, and true believers like me, who cared more about the mission than the paycheck. We worked in obscurity, a ghost division within the larger empire. Marcus would occasionally visit, striding through our modest lab in his $1,000 suit, a look of bemused contempt on his face. "Still playing with test tubes, Eli?" he'd ask. "Let me know when you invent something that can unload a container ship faster." My father almost never came. Our interactions were limited to tense quarterly budget meetings where I would have to justify every penny spent on genomic sequencers and mass spectrometers. "When do I see a product, Elias?" he would demand. "When is this going to be profitable?" I tried to explain that this kind of foundational science wasn't like manufacturing widgets. It was a process of discovery, of failures and incremental successes. He would just shake his head. "In my world, son, if you're not making money, you're losing it. And you are losing a lot of it." But we weren't. We were building the most sophisticated gene therapy platform in the world. We were just doing it in secret. The breakthrough, the one I'd had just a week before that fateful dinner, was what I called the keystone. It was an epigenetic activator, a unique synthetic enzyme that acted as a master key. My research showed that you could design the perfect therapeutic agent to clear plaques and repair neural pathways, but without the keystone to unlock the specific cellular mechanisms and allow the agent to do its work without triggering a massive immune response, it was useless. It would be like having the world's most advanced car without an ignition key. The car is perfect, but it's not going anywhere. The keystone was the culmination of everything. It was complex, elegant, and so counterintuitive that I knew no one else would ever stumble upon it. And because it was so critical, and because I had grown so paranoid after years of my father's threats to shut us down, I protected it. The full formula and synthesis process for the keystone enzyme existed in only one place: my head. The raw data on the servers they were selling to Omnigen was a roadmap to a treasure chest. But I was the only person alive who possessed the key to open it. When my father announced the sale, my first feeling was shock. My second was devastation. But as I lay in my bed that night, staring at the ceiling of my childhood bedroom, a third feeling began to emerge. A cold, hard, calculating resolve. They thought they had sold my life's work. They were wrong. They had only sold the cage. The bird was still free, and I was about to learn how to fly. The 48 hours following that dinner were a masterclass in corporate efficiency and personal hell. The machine of Vance Industries, once I was in its crosshairs, moved with terrifying speed. My father, it turned out, had been negotiating with Omnigen for months. The dinner wasn't a discussion. It was a verdict that had been reached long before the soup was served. The next morning, I was summoned not to my father's study, but to the 50th floor conference room at the Vance Industries headquarters in Manhattan. The room was a glass-walled monstrosity overlooking Central Park, designed to make visitors feel small and insignificant. It worked. Waiting for me were my father, Marcus, and a team of lawyers who looked like they were chiseled from granite. At the head of the table, projected onto a massive screen via a video link from their headquarters in Basel, Switzerland, was Dr. Alistair Finch, the head of acquisitions for Omnigen. He had a face of reptilian calm and eyes that held no light. "Dr. Vance," Finch began, his voice a smooth, accentless baritone. "A pleasure to finally meet you, even virtually. I must say, your father has driven a hard bargain, but we believe we have a fair deal. Your foundational work is intriguing, very intriguing." The way he said foundational work made my skin crawl. It was like a butcher admiring the frame of a prize-winning bull he was about to slaughter. My own father didn't even look at me. He was all business, directing his comments to the lawyers. All intellectual property held by the Vance Scientific Solutions subsidiary will be transferred. This includes all research data, lab notes, preliminary patent filings, and biological samples. The lab equipment and the facility in Bridgeport are also part of the package. He was selling the very bones of my creation. Marcus sat beside him, preening. He was the one who had initiated the contact with Omnigen, seeing it as a way to prove his business acumen to my father by turning my money pit into a profit center. "We've assured Omnigen full cooperation," Marcus added, smiling at the screen. "Dr. Vance will, of course, be available during a transitional period to ensure a smooth handover of all materials and methodologies to Dr. Finch's team." That was the first I had heard of it. I was being sold along with the lab equipment. "No," I said. The word was quiet, but it cut through the hum of the air conditioning like a razor. Every head in the room turned to me. "I'm sorry?" my father said, his voice laced with menace. It was the tone he used for insubordinate junior executives just before he fired them. "I will not be part of any transitional period," I repeated, finding a strength I didn't know I possessed. "The deal is for the assets of the subsidiary. I am not an asset. I am a person. And I resign, effective immediately." The color drained from my father's face. Marcus shot to his feet. "You can't do that. You have to help them. It's part of the deal." "Then it's a bad deal," I said, looking not at him, but at the face of Alistair Finch on the screen. "Dr. Finch, you are buying a library of books written in a dead language. Without a translator, they are just paper and ink. I am the translator." Finch's calm expression didn't waver, but I saw a flicker of interest in his eyes. He was intelligent enough to understand the implication. My father, however, was not. "Don't be ridiculous, Elias," he boomed. "The data is the data. It's all there. Any competent biochemist can replicate the work. You are not that special." It was the sentence he had been telling me my entire life, in 1,000 different ways. And for the first time, it had no power over me. Because I knew something he didn't. I knew about the keystone. I knew that all the data in the world couldn't lead them to it without the spark of intuition. The decade of failed experiments, the ghost of my grandmother whispering in my ear that had led me there. I had built a labyrinth of research, and I was the only one with the map. "Then your competent biochemists can have at it," I said, standing up. "My resignation stands." I turned and walked out of the room, leaving a stunned silence in my wake. The fury from my father and Marcus was palpable, but I didn't care. The die was cast. That afternoon, I went back to my lab for the last time. It was a strange, hollow experience. My team, my brilliant, loyal team, had been told of the sale that morning. They were being offered positions at Omnigen, a move that would quintuple their salaries but destroy the collaborative, mission-driven culture we had built. Some would take it. I couldn't blame them. They had families to feed, mortgages to pay. My lead biologist, a woman named Dr. Anya Sharma, met me at the door. Her eyes were red. "They don't understand what they've bought, do they?" she whispered. "They think it's just a formula." "They have no idea," I confirmed. "What about the keystone, Eli?" "It's not in the final documentation." I checked. I looked at her, my oldest and most trusted colleague. "Anya, I need you to do something for me. I need you to destroy all my personal backups, the ones on the encrypted drives. Everything." She understood immediately. We had personal servers, completely off the Vance Industries network, where I stored my theoretical work and more speculative experiments. It was a failsafe. "Consider it done," she said, her expression grim. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to disappear," I told her. The final act was the signing. My father forced my hand, threatening to withhold my personal trust fund money my grandmother had left me unless I signed the final transfer documents. I was legally required to as the director of the subsidiary, so I did it. I sat in a lawyer's office, the same granite-faced men from before watching me, and I signed away 10 years of my life. As my father and Marcus watched, I initialed page after page, my signature a testament to my own execution. When it was over, my father slid a check across the table. It was for $5 million. "Your share," he said, his voice cold, "after the company recouped its initial investment and took its profit." "Don't say I never gave you anything." I looked at the check, at the crisp paper that represented the price of my soul. Then, I looked at him. I didn't take it. "I don't want your money," I said. "I want you to remember this moment. I want you to remember what you paid for my life's work. Because one day, you're going to understand the true cost of what you sold today. And it's going to be so much more than $20 million. I stood up, left the check on the table, and walked out of that office without looking back. That night, I packed a single bag, emptied my personal bank account, and drove west, away from the glittering towers of Manhattan, away from the suffocating legacy of the Vance name. They thought they had my research. They thought they had the money. They thought they had won. What they really had was a ticking time bomb, and I had just lit the fuse. Leaving everything behind is a romantic notion until you're actually doing it. There was nothing romantic about driving a 10-year-old sedan through the endless cornfields of Ohio, sleeping in cheap motels that smelled of stale cigarettes, and living off a diet of gas station, coffee, and protein bars. I had walked away from a $5 million check, which meant I was starting from scratch with only the few $100,000 I had in my personal savings. It was a lot of money to most people, but in the world of high-level biotech research, it was barely enough to rent a lab for a month. I wasn't just running from my family, I was running toward a future I had to invent on the fly. I needed a place to disappear, A place where the long arm of Vance Industries and the even longer arm of Omnigen couldn't find me. A place where I could rebuild. I found it in the most unlikely of locations. A dusty, sun-bleached corner of New Mexico just outside of Santa Fe. It was a place of stark beauty and isolation. The tech world was obsessed with hubs like Silicon Valley and Boston, cluttered with venture capitalists and corporate spies. No one would ever think to look for the next big thing in biotechnology here, amidst the artists, the mystics, and the quiet hum of the desert. I rented a small, unassuming adobe house and, more importantly, a defunct auto body shop on the outskirts of town. It was a greasy, cavernous space, but it was perfect. It had high ceilings, robust electrical systems, and enough space to build a real laboratory from the ground up in complete secrecy. For the first year, I was a ghost. I paid for everything in cash. I used a pseudonym, Liam Case, for all my local dealings. The locals were a tight-lipped bunch who respected privacy. They probably thought I was a writer or an artist with a trust fund. They didn't ask questions. My days were a grueling routine. I'd spend hours online, using encrypted networks to source second-hand lab equipment centrifuges from a defunct lab in Texas, a PCR machine from a university surplus auction in California, a high-resolution microscope from an importer in Canada. I became an expert in logistics, just like my father. But my cargo wasn't consumer goods. It was the building blocks of my resurrection. At night, I worked on the theory. I didn't need a physical lab to refine the formula for the keystone. The real work happened in the complex, multi-dimensional models I built on a supercomputer I assembled myself from dozens of smaller machines. I would sit for hours, surrounded by the desert silence, the only light coming from the glowing lines of code on my monitors. I was a solitary monk, illuminating a sacred text that only I could read. But even a monk needs a connection to the outside world. Mine came in the form of Dr. Lena Petrova. Lena was a brilliant, fiercely independent molecular biologist I had known at MIT. We had been friendly rivals, two of the sharpest minds in our program, constantly pushing each other. After graduation, she had resisted the lure of big pharma and taken a position at a small independent research institute in Arizona, valuing freedom over funding. I reached out to her 6 months into my new life, using a secure, anonymous email address. I didn't tell her who I was at first, only presenting her with a series of theoretical problems related to enzymatic synthesis. I knew her area of expertise was the missing piece I needed to make the keystone not just viable, but scalable. Her replies were sharp, insightful, and intrigued. After a month of anonymous correspondence, I finally took a leap of faith. I sent her a message. I think we should meet. There's something big here. P.S. It's Elias Vance. Her response came an hour later. I wondered if that was you. No one else is that brilliant or that arrogant. Arizona or New Mexico? We met at a tiny, dusty diner halfway between our two locations. She walked in, her piercing blue eyes sizing me up. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. I heard what happened, she said, sliding into the booth. Your father sold your entire life's work to the devil himself. The whole biotech community was talking about it. Most people think you had a nervous breakdown and are living in a cabin somewhere without internet. I smiled faintly. Close. An auto body shop with very good internet. For the next 3 hours, I laid everything out for her. The full scope of Project Chimera, the betrayal, and the secret of the keystone. I explained that I had the blueprint, but I needed her expertise in protein manufacturing to build the factory. I wasn't just offering her a job. I was offering her a partnership, a chance to be on the ground floor of the most important medical discovery of our lifetime. So let me get this straight, she said, after I finished, stirring her coffee. You want to build a secret, multi-million-dollar biotech lab in a garage in the desert to synthesize a revolutionary enzyme that only you know how to make? In order to eventually hold a $100 billion pharmaceutical giant hostage and, in the process, cure Alzheimer's disease. That about sums it up, I said. She was silent for a full minute, her eyes searching mine. I could see the gears turning in her brilliant mind, weighing the insane risk against the world-changing potential. Finally, she broke into a slow grin. "Okay, Vance," she said, extending her hand across the table. "You're certifiably insane. When do we start?" Lena's arrival changed everything. She wasn't just a brilliant scientist. She was a force of nature. She brought discipline, pragmatism, and a healthy dose of skepticism that tempered my obsessive focus. Together, we transformed that greasy garage into a state-of-the-art laboratory. We called our new secret venture Etheria Biosciences. The name was her idea. Aether, the mythical fifth element, the pure essence breathed by the gods. It was perfect. It took us 2 more years. 2 years of 18-hour days, of frustrating failures and tiny, exhilarating victories. While the world forgot about Elias Vance, Liam Case and Lena Petrova were building an ark. And then, one rainy Tuesday afternoon, it happened. We ran the final synthesis sequence. I watched the mass spectrometer churn out the data, my heart hammering against my ribs. Lena stood beside me, holding her breath. The graph appeared on the screen. A single, perfect, beautiful spike, exactly where the theoretical model predicted it should be. 100% purity. We had done it. We had created the keystone. We had the key. That night, we didn't celebrate with champagne. We sat on the hood of my old car outside the lab, looking up at the vast, star-filled desert sky. Omnigen just posted their quarterly report, Lena said, scrolling through her phone. They've officially advanced their new Alzheimer's drug, Rememoria, to Phase 2 clinical trials. They're sinking $500 million into it this year alone. Their press release mentions the foundational research acquired from Vance Scientific Solutions. I just nodded, a slow smile spreading across my face. They were building the most expensive, most advanced, most beautiful car in the world. And in a little garage in the middle of nowhere, we were the only 2 people on Earth who knew how to start the engine. The race hadn't even begun. With the keystone synthesized, the mission of Etheria Biosciences shifted. Phase 1 was survival and creation. Phase 2 was growth and strategy. We couldn't stay a 2-person operation in a desert garage forever. To challenge a titan like Omnigen, we needed to become a titan ourselves. But a silent one. An empire built in the shadows. This is where Lena's pragmatism truly shone. While I was the visionary, the architect of the science, she was the master builder of the business. She understood that our secret was our greatest asset, but it was also our greatest vulnerability. We needed funding, we needed infrastructure, and we needed to build a company without ever revealing the true ace up our sleeve. Our first move was to create a corporate shell, a holding company based in Delaware with layers of anonymity that would make it nearly impossible to trace ownership back to us. Through this shell, we began to file a series of interlocking, highly specific patents. Not for the keystone itself, that was still too risky, but for the manufacturing process, for novel applications of similar enzymatic activators, for everything around the keystone. We were building a patent wall, a fortress of intellectual property that would protect our core discovery when the time came to reveal it. This process required capital, and that meant facing the world I had shunned, the world of venture finance. But we couldn't walk into a Sand Hill Road office in Silicon Valley. The VCs there were all connected. Word would get back to the Omnigens of the world in a heartbeat. Instead, we targeted a different kind of investor. Quiet, family-run funds in places like Zurich and Singapore. Old money firms that valued discretion and long-term vision over the frantic, hype-driven cycles of the American tech scene. Lena prepared the pitch deck. It was a work of genius. It never mentioned Alzheimer's. It never mentioned Omnigen. It focused entirely on our patented manufacturing platform, framing it as a revolutionary way to produce highly complex synthetic enzymes for a wide range of industrial and medical applications. We positioned Etheria as a B2B company, a pick and shovel play in the biotech gold rush. We weren't selling the gold, we were selling the tools to mine it. We flew to Zurich for our first meeting. I was still Liam Case, a reclusive lead scientist. Lena was the CEO, the charismatic face of the company. We sat in a centuries-old office overlooking Lake Geneva, pitching our futuristic vision to a panel of stern-faced Swiss bankers. They listened intently, their questions precise and ruthless. They grilled us for hours on our technology, our business model, our financials. At the end of the meeting, the chairman, a man in his late 70s named Klaus Richter, peered at me over his glasses. "Your science is formidable, Mr. Case," he said. "Almost too formidable for its stated application. This platform feels like a high-performance racing engine you're proposing to put in a city bus. What is the real race you intend to run?" I met his gaze. This was the moment of truth. I couldn't tell him everything, but I had to give him something. "Mr. Richter," I said, "right now we are building the best city buses in the world, and we will make a great deal of money doing so. But you are correct. One day, when the time is right, we intend to enter the Formula One. And we are going to win." A slow smile spread across his ancient face. He understood. He didn't need to know the details. He could see the scale of the ambition. We walked out of that meeting with a $30 million seed investment. That money was the fuel we needed. We left the desert garage behind and established our official headquarters in a secure, anonymous research park in Salt Lake City, another city off the beaten biotech path. We built a world-class facility, a gleaming cathedral of science hidden inside a boring concrete box. We began hiring a small, elite team, vetting each candidate with a level of scrutiny that would make the CIA blush. We paid them exceptionally well, but they were bound by ironclad non-disclosure agreements. They knew they were working on cutting-edge enzyme synthesis, but only Lena and I knew the final, ultimate purpose of their work. For the next 3 years, Etheria grew exponentially, but quietly. We became a profitable business, securing contracts with agricultural companies to create enzymes that increased crop yields, and with chemical companies to create biocatalysts for green manufacturing. Each contract was a success, adding to our revenue and reputation as a leader in bespoke protein design. We were the company that could make the impossible molecules. All the while, I was watching OmniGen. I had set up alerts. I followed their press releases. I read every scientific paper their teams published. They were pouring money into Rememoria, the drug based on my stolen research. They had successfully navigated Phase 2 trials, showing promising, but inconsistent, results in reducing amyloid plaques. Their stock price soared on the news. The media hailed Rememoria as a potential miracle cure. My father and Marcus were lauded in business publications as savvy visionaries who had spotted the potential in my research and brokered a brilliant deal. I read an interview with Marcus in Forbes where he took credit for the entire thing. "I always believed in my brother's work," he lied, "but it needed a real business mind to unlock its commercial potential. We saw the value and brought in the right partner to take it to the finish line." The hypocrisy was so staggering it was almost impressive. But I could see the cracks forming. I read the detailed trial data that was published in medical journals, and I saw what the market didn't. The results were inconsistent. The drug worked wonders in a small subset of patients, but had little to no effect on others. They couldn't figure out why. They were running into the very wall I knew they would hit. They had the therapeutic agent, but it couldn't get through the door to do its job effectively without a key. They were trying to pick the lock, spending hundreds of millions on brute force trial and error, but they were failing. Their public statements were full of confidence, but I knew, on a deep, fundamental level, that inside the walls of OmniGen, a quiet panic was beginning to set in. They were too far in. They had bet the company's future on Rememoria. The CEO had promised it to shareholders, to patients, to the world. They couldn't afford to fail now. The car was rolling downhill, gathering speed. and they were just now realizing they didn't have any brakes. I, on the other hand, was patiently waiting at the bottom of the hill. Etheria was no longer a startup. We were a silent, profitable $100 million empire with zero debt, a war chest of capital, and a single secret weapon that was about to become the most valuable molecule on the planet. The time for hiding was almost over. The time for hunting was about to begin. For 3 years, the world of biotechnology revolved around a ghost. That ghost was OmniGen's Rememoria. It was the most talked about, most anticipated, most heavily invested in drug in modern history. Analyst reports projected its market value in the hundreds of billions. Patient advocacy groups spoke of it in hushed, hopeful tones. My father and brother were regulars on financial news networks, lauded as the brilliant deal-makers who had positioned OmniGen for this historic success. They were hailed as heroes who had turned a family business's speculative research into the salvation of millions. And all of it, every single press release and stock market surge, was built on a foundation of sand. Because while they were celebrating in public, I knew their scientists were failing in private. They were throwing armies of researchers and hundreds of millions of dollars at the problem, trying to understand the inconsistency of their clinical trial data, but they were missing the fundamental insight. They were trying to build a cathedral with blueprints that were missing the section on the foundation. Inside Etheria, we were preparing for the next phase of our plan. It wasn't enough to have the keystone. It wasn't enough to be a profitable, silent empire. If we simply approached OmniGen with our solution, they would use their corporate might to crush us. They would tie us up in litigation for years, claim our work was derivative of the data they'd purchased, and bleed us dry. We couldn't knock on the front door. We had to create a situation where they were forced to beg us to come inside, and that meant we had to subtly, surgically, and anonymously expose the fatal flaw in their miracle drug to the entire world. This was Lena's brainchild, and it was terrifyingly brilliant. "We can't attack them," she explained one night, as we stood before a whiteboard covered in complex diagrams. "We have to attack the science. We publish." Her plan was simple in its audacity. We would write a theoretical paper for a highly respected, peer-reviewed journal. The paper would not mention OmniGen, Rememoria, or Etheria. It would be a purely academic exercise. In it, we would lay out a detailed molecular model explaining why current therapeutic approaches to amyloid plaque clearance were statistically likely to fail due to variable immune responses and cellular uptake resistance. We would describe, with painstaking accuracy, the exact problem OmniGen was facing in their labs, but frame it as a future hurdle for the entire field. And then, in the final section of the paper, we would propose a hypothetical solution. We would describe the need for a specific type of epigenetic activator, a unique enzymatic key that could unlock the cellular pathways and allow a therapeutic agent to work. We wouldn't give them the formula for the keystone, of course. That would be like publishing the blueprints for the atomic bomb. Instead, we would describe the shape of the keyhole. We would give the entire scientific community a detailed architectural drawing of the lock, and then let them watch as OmniGen failed, over and over, to pick it. We submitted the paper under the names of 2 of our most trusted senior scientists, individuals with pristine academic records but no public connection to me or Lena. It was accepted for publication in Cell, one of the most prestigious scientific journals in the world. The day it was published online, a quiet earthquake shook the foundations of the biotech industry. At first, it was just a whisper. A few prominent neurologists and biochemists began discussing the paper on academic forums. They called its central thesis revolutionary, and a sobering reality check for the industry. Within a week, the whispers grew louder. The financial analysts who covered the biotech sector started to take notice. They weren't scientists, but they were smart enough to understand the implications. The paper was casting a long, dark shadow of doubt directly over the science behind OmniGen's flagship drug. I watched OmniGen's official response. It was dismissive, almost arrogant. Their chief scientific officer released a statement calling the paper an interesting but purely speculative piece of academic theory that had no bearing on the robust and positive results of their rememoria trials. But it was too late. The seed of doubt had been planted. The ghost in their machine now had a name. University labs from Stanford to Johns Hopkins began trying to replicate the problem we had outlined, and they succeeded. They confirmed our model. The industry started buzzing. If the Keystone Theory, as they began to call it, was correct, then rememoria, as it was currently designed, was a dead end. The first real crack appeared 3 months later. A leaked internal memo from the FDA expressed significant concerns about the inconsistent efficacy data from Omnigen's Phase 2 trials and requested a new round of studies, delaying their move to Phase 3 by at least a year. Omnigen's stock, which had been trading at an all-time high, dropped 20% in a single day. My father and Marcus appeared on CNBC that evening, their faces pale but their words defiant. "This is a minor procedural delay," my father insisted, his voice a little too loud. "We have complete confidence in our science and our team. Rememoria is the future." Marcus, sitting beside him, looked less confident. He was a businessman, not a scientist. He didn't understand the nuance of the problem, but he understood the language of a plummeting stock price. For the first time, I saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. He had hitched his entire career, his entire legacy, to this drug, and the ground beneath his feet was beginning to crumble. Back in Salt Lake City, we watched the chaos unfold with a detached calm. Etheria's business was booming. Our industrial enzyme contracts were generating tens of millions in pure profit. We were hiring more staff, expanding our facilities, and quietly filing more patents, creating an impenetrable web of intellectual property around the Keystone. We were a submarine, running silent and deep, while on the surface, the flagship of our enemy was taking on water. Lena walked into my office one afternoon and placed a tablet on my desk. It was an internal job posting from Omnigen's career portal. They were seeking a new director of enzymatic synthesis, specifically looking for someone with experience in novel epigenetic activators. They were trying to build the key. "They're getting desperate," she said, a small, triumphant smile on her face. "They've publicly denied our theory, but privately, they're trying to solve it. They're pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into trying to invent something that's already sitting in a freezer 2 floors below us." I looked at the job posting, then out the window at the distant mountains. For 5 years, I had been the ghost, the forgotten son, the failed scientist. But the roles were reversing. I was no longer the one being haunted. I had become the haunter. And the silent empire I had built in the shadows was finally ready to step into the light and claim its throne. The next year was a slow, agonizing death march for Omnigen. Their attempt to internally develop their own version of the Keystone was a catastrophic failure. They burned through an estimated $500 million, poaching top scientists from rivals and building entire new research wings, but they were chasing a ghost. You can't reverse engineer an epiphany. You can't brute force a decade of insight. They were like a team of the world's best locksmiths trying to crack a safe, not knowing the combination was tied to the birthday of a woman they had never met, my grandmother. The delay with the FDA turned from a procedural hurdle into a permanent roadblock. The more data they were forced to produce, the more obvious the inconsistency of rememoria became. The scientific community, once their biggest cheerleader, had turned on them. The Keystone Theory was now the accepted paradigm, and Omnigen was seen as a corporate dinosaur, clinging to outdated science out of hubris and desperation. Their stock price collapsed. It fell from a high of over $400 a share to less than $50. They were in a death spiral. Shareholders were in open revolt. Class action lawsuits were being filed, and the board was in a panic. The CEO who had championed the acquisition of my research was fired. My father and Marcus, once the darlings of the financial world, were now pariahs. They stopped appearing on television. The Forbes articles were replaced with scathing editorials in the Wall Street Journal questioning their judgment and due diligence. I felt a grim, cold satisfaction watching their public humiliation, but it was secondary to the larger mission. Their failure was a necessary precondition for my success. Now that they were on their knees, it was time to make our move. But I wasn't going to be the one to do it. My anonymity was still my most powerful weapon. I flew to Zurich to meet with Klaus Richter, the old-world banker who had given us our first investment. Etheria had already made his fund a fortune through our legitimate industrial contracts, and he had become a trusted, if silent, partner. We sat in his office, the same one where I had first pitched him as Liam Case. This time, I told him everything. The family betrayal, the stolen research, the keystone, and the imminent collapse of OmniGen's entire neurotherapeutic pipeline. He listened without interruption, his ancient eyes missing nothing. When I was finished, he simply tented his fingers and nodded. So, the city bus was, in fact, a rocket ship, he said. I am not surprised. And now you wish to fly it. What do you need from me? I need an intermediary, I explained. I want you to approach the OmniGen board on behalf of an anonymous, specialized biotech firm. You will make them an offer, not to buy their company, but to partner with them to save Rememoria. His eyebrow arched. A partnership? After what they did? That sounds benevolent. The first offer is always benevolent, I said. It's the second one that matters. The plan was a multi-stage trap. Klaus, acting as our proxy, would offer OmniGen a lifeline. Etheria would provide our proprietary synthesis platform and a novel enzymatic activator, the keystone, to make Rememoria work. In exchange, we wouldn't ask for cash. We would ask for a 51% controlling interest in the Rememoria patent and all future profits. It was an aggressive, almost insulting offer. They would be forced to give up control of their crown jewel to an anonymous upstart. But their alternative was to admit complete failure and face bankruptcy. 2 weeks later, Klaus made the approach. The OmniGen board, desperate and cornered, was intrigued but also deeply suspicious. Who was this mystery company that had seemingly solved the biggest problem in modern medicine? They demanded to know our identity. Klaus refused, citing his client's strict confidentiality requirements. He provided them with a small, sanitized sample of the keystone and a protocol for them to test it in their own labs. The science will speak for itself, he told them. The week they spent testing that sample must have been agony for them. I can only imagine the scene in their lab, their top scientists, who had failed for years, watching as our enzyme did exactly what we promised. The results, I was told later, were miraculous. 100% efficacy in their cellular models. The lock had been opened. The car had been started. The OmniGen board was now in an impossible position. They had proof that a cure was possible, but the key was owned by a ghost, and that ghost was demanding half their kingdom. They countered. They offered us $10 billion in cash for a full buyout of Etheria. They tried to throw money at the problem, the only solution they knew. Klaus, on my instruction, politely refused. My client is not interested in a cash payout, he informed them. They are interested in the cure. They believe they are the only ones who can properly steward it to the finish line. The 51% offer is the only offer. They stalled for another week, their stock price continuing to bleed as rumors of a potential partnership leaked to the press. Finally, they cracked. They agreed to a meeting. Their new CEO, their head of R&D, and their entire legal team would meet with the CEO and lead scientist of our anonymous company to finalize the terms of the partnership. They wanted to look their saviors and future owners in the eye. The meeting was set for the following Tuesday. The location they chose was, in a stroke of beautiful, poetic irony, the main boardroom at the Vance Industries headquarters in Manhattan. My father, as a major shareholder in OmniGen through the initial stock deal, and Marcus, as a board member, were required to attend. They were about to come face to face with the ghost who had been haunting them for 6 years. I flew to New York, but I didn't stay in a hotel. I stayed in my old, empty apartment, which I had kept all these years, a silent monument to the life I'd left behind. The night before the meeting, I stood on the balcony, looking out at the city skyline. I felt a strange sense of calm. The anger that had fueled me for so long had cooled, forged into something harder, sharper. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about reclamation. It was about taking back what was mine and, in doing so, finally fulfilling the promise I had made at my grandmother's bedside all those years ago. The next morning, I put on a custom-tailored Tom Ford suit, the kind of corporate armor my father and brother wore. Lena met me in the lobby, looking sharp and confident in a dark blue power suit. "Ready to go see some ghosts?" she asked, a wry smile on her face. "They're not the ghosts, Lena," I said, straightening my tie. "We are." The Vance Industries boardroom was exactly as I remembered it, a cold, cavernous temple of corporate power on the 50th floor. The long obsidian table reflected the gray Manhattan sky, and the wall of windows offered a panoramic view of Central Park, a world away from the brutal negotiations that took place within its walls. It was the room where my father had pronounced my life's work dead. Today, it would be the room where it was resurrected. Lena and I were shown in by a nervous-looking executive assistant. The entire senior leadership of Omnigen was already seated on one side of the table. Their faces were a mixture of exhaustion, desperation, and resentment. At the far end of the table, looking small and diminished in the space he once commanded, sat my father. Beside him, Marcus fidgeted with his pen, his usual smugness replaced by a tense, hunted look. He had aged a decade in the last year. They looked up as we entered, their expressions clinical and curious, waiting to see the faces of the people who held their company's fate in their hands. Lena, as the CEO of Etheria, walked in first, her presence confident and commanding. I followed a half-step behind, in my role as the reclusive lead scientist. I kept my head slightly lowered, allowing the shadows and my position behind Lena to obscure my face for a moment. My father and Marcus didn't even give me a second glance. They were focused on Lena, the woman who had brought them to their knees. The CEO of Omnigen, a stern-faced woman named Julianne Hayes, stood up. "Miss Petrova," she said, her voice tight. "Thank you for coming. We have reviewed your final proposal. To be frank, the terms are unprecedented. Before we proceed, we insist on understanding who we are getting into business with." Lena smiled coolly. "Omnigen is in the business of results, Miss Hayes, and we have provided you with results. Our identity is irrelevant." "It is anything but," my father interjected, his voice raspy. He hadn't stood up. "We are talking about handing over control of $100 billion therapeutic. We will not do it blind." Lena held his gaze. "The firm you are partnering with is Etheria Biosciences. We are the world leader in bespoke enzymatic synthesis. And this," she said, turning and gesturing toward me, "is the man who made it all possible. Our founder and chief scientific officer, Dr. Liam Case." This was the moment. I slowly lifted my head, stepping out from behind Lena's shadow into the full light of the boardroom, and looked directly at my father and my brother. For a full 3 seconds, there was nothing. Just a flicker of confusion in their eyes as they tried to place my face. It was familiar, but impossible. Elias Vance was a failure, a ghost living in obscurity. He couldn't be here, in this room, at the center of the biggest deal in biotech history. My father was the first to recognize me. The color drained from his face, leaving behind a sick, gray pallor. He made a small, choking sound, his hand flying to his chest as if he couldn't breathe.